So Prince William and Catherine have made a decision about Camilla's future that Charles never imagined hearing from his own son. And when the king finally understood what they were proposing, he didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply sat there in silence because this wasn't about a title or another family disagreement hidden behind palace doors. William and Catherine were drawing a boundary around the next reign, and Camilla was standing on the other side of it. And before the meeting was over, Charles heard one sentence that changed the entire Queen Mother model around him. Before we get into it, if you want more royal deep dives like this one, hit subscribe to our channel. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps the channel. At 6:25 on Thursday, the 13th of August, 2026, Windsor Castle was already quiet when the meeting began. Charles had expected another discussion about the future, the kind of conversation that usually disappeared into briefing papers and private notes. Instead, William placed a dark blue folder on the table and told his father that the question concerned something much larger than schedules or staff. It concerned what happened to a royal household when its sovereign was no longer the sovereign. Charles looked at the folder but didn't touch it. Catherine sat beside William, unusually still. That detail caught his attention first. She wasn't there as an observer. She had helped shape the proposal, and Charles understood immediately that whatever was inside had already passed through a serious discussion between the future king and queen. William opened the folder. The first page carried a simple heading, Transition of the Royal Household. Beneath it was a sentence that sounded almost harmless. The working institution of the monarchy would transfer to the new sovereign without automatic continuation of the previous sovereign's household. Charles read it twice. Then he asked the question that made the room colder. What does that mean for Camilla? William didn't answer immediately. Catherine did. It means the next reign begins with the next sovereign. There was no accusation in her voice, no reference to old arguments, no mention of Diana, no comparison with the Queen Mother, no suggestion that Camilla had done anything wrong. The proposal was being presented as a rule rather than a judgment. But Charles could see the consequence. If he died before Camilla, her position inside the family could remain respected, her charitable interests could continue, and her relationship with the next generation could remain personal. What would not continue automatically was the machinery around her. Staff would not simply transfer. Communications offices would not inherit authority. Residences used for official work would not become permanent headquarters by precedent. Invitations and public duties would depend on the new sovereign. Charles leaned back. For decades, royal transitions had carried people and institutions forward because continuity was considered safer than sudden change. The Queen Mother had remained a powerful public figure after George VI died. Clarence House became a familiar symbol of that continuing presence. Charles had grown up believing that a widow could remain part of the monarchy's public life without threatening the new reign. William was proposing a different boundary. The family could continue. The institution could reset. Charles looked toward Catherine and asked whether she truly believed that principle was necessary. Catherine nodded. Then she added something that changed the argument completely. If George became king before me, I would expect the same rule. Charles watched her carefully. She continued. She would not expect her former staff to become her permanent household. She would not expect an independent communications operation because she had once been queen. She would not expect George to inherit the crown while also inheriting an institutional obligation to preserve his mother's authority. The proposal wasn't being built around Camilla alone. The advisors had warned William that such a rule would only work if it could survive personalities involved. That was why Catherine insisted on language generations could understand without knowing the arguments that created it. It had to begin with one assumption. The crown moves, and the institution moves with it. Charles noticed the seriousness in his son's expression. This was not a plan for the morning after his death. It was an attempt to prevent that morning from becoming a scramble. At 6:47, the discussion moved from principal to the part Charles had been expecting all evening. Clarence House. Charles asked whether the proposal meant the residence itself would be affected. William said the question was not whether a building could remain available to family. The question was whether it would remain an operating center of royal authority after a new reign began. That distinction mattered. A residence could be personal. A residence could also become institutional when staff, communications, meetings, briefings, and public engagements were organized from it. Once that machinery continued, the previous reign could remain visible in ways that quietly complicated the next one. Charles knew exactly what William meant. He had seen the Queen Mother continue her public life from Clarence House for decades. Her household had become part of monarchy's landscape. She was respected, recognizable, and enormously influential. To Charles, that history represented continuity. To William, it also represented a precedent that might not fit the monarchy he expected George to inherit. Catherine opened another page. The proposal did not demand that a surviving consort withdraw from public life. It did not require silence, isolation, or disappearance. It created a difference between being royal family and operating an institutional household. That difference was the heart of the document. Camilla could remain Camilla. She could continue causes she personally cared about. She could attend major family occasions. She could support charities where the new sovereign wanted her involvement. She could receive invitations and maintain a public identity. But the machinery would belong to the reigning king and queen. Charles stared at the page. Then he asked whether William understood how the arrangement would look outside the castle. William said he did. Every headline would become personal. Every explanation would invite speculation. Commentators would say Camilla was being pushed aside. Others would claim William was finally reshaping the monarchy around his own family. Catherine would be accused of writing rules that conveniently protected her from the same criticism she was directing toward Camilla. Catherine interrupted. Then make the rule bigger than us. She pointed to the language. The principle would apply to every future surviving consort. Regardless of name, family history, popularity, or relationship with the incoming sovereign. It would apply if the former queen were beloved. It would apply if she were controversial. It would apply if the former king had died after a long reign or unexpectedly early. William nodded. That was why the document had been written without personal references. No Camilla. No Diana. No Clarence House as a target. No language of punishment. Only a boundary between one reign and the next. Charles asked what happened if the new sovereign wanted a former consort to keep a larger role. William answered that the sovereign could invite it. That answer was important. Nothing in the proposal would prevent George from asking Catherine to continue public work if he became king while she was alive. Nothing would prevent a future monarch from giving a former consort patronages, ceremonial responsibilities, or access to royal facilities. What disappeared was automatic authority. The incoming sovereign would choose. The previous reign would not choose for him. Charles lowered his eyes. For the first time, the document sounded less like a restriction and more like a transfer of control. The monarchy would not be required to carry an old household forward simply because doing so had once been customary. At 7:02, Charles asked for one more thing. He wanted Camilla in the room. William agreed. Catherine closed the folder. The next conversation would no longer be about theory either. At 7:10, Camilla entered the room and immediately noticed the silence. Charles was standing near the window. William remained beside the table. Catherine was seated with the folder closed in front of her. Camilla looked from one face to another. "What is this about?" Charles began, but William gently took over. He explained that the discussion concerned the structure of the next reign, and the principle that the institutional household should belong to the reigning sovereign. Camilla listened. Then she asked the question everyone knew was coming. "So when Charles is gone, what happens to me?" William answered carefully. "You remain family." Camilla waited. "And the rest?" Catherine spoke. "The rest depends on the next sovereign." There was no triumph in her voice. Camilla studied her for several seconds, perhaps expecting a harder answer. Catherine continued. "The rule would apply to me too." She explained that if William died first and George became king, she would not expect George to preserve a separate court simply because she had once been queen. She would not expect staff to remain attached to her automatically. She would not expect her communications operation to survive as an independent source of royal authority. Camilla looked toward Charles. He was silent. William then explained what the proposal did not mean. It did not erase Camilla's lawful position within the family. It did not prevent her from continuing charitable work. It did not forbid public appearances. It did not require her to disappear from national life. It meant that public authority would come from the reigning sovereign. Camilla looked down at the folder. Then Clarence's house. William said the residence would be reviewed when the new reign began. Its future would depend on the needs of the new household, rather than an automatic assumption that the previous arrangement continued. That answer hurt because it was practical. There was no dramatic removal to announce, no single order that could be blamed. Instead, a series of assumptions had been removed one by one. Camilla could remain visible. She could remain respected. She could remain loved by the family. But she could not carry an inherited court into the next reign simply because one had existed before. Charles finally spoke. He said he understood the principle, but asked whether William knew what it would feel like for a surviving spouse to lose an entire institutional world after decades of service. William looked at his father. "Yes." The room fell quiet. He said the monarchy had to distinguish between grief and government. A family could protect its members emotionally without allowing institutional authority to become permanent simply because a reign had ended. Catherine added that this was why the rule had to be decided before a crisis. If the question were left until Charles died, every decision could appear emotional. Every appointment could look like favoritism. Every residence could become a symbol. Planning now made the boundary impersonal. Charles looked at the three people in the room. Then he closed the folder. He neither approved everything immediately nor rejected it. Instead, he asked William one final question. "Is this really the monarchy you want George to inherit?" William answered yes. "One crown," he said, "and one institution behind it." Catherine looked at him. Charles remained silent for several seconds. Outside, Windsor continued as though nothing had changed. The meeting ended without a public announcement. When one reign ends, the next sovereign does not inherit another person's court. He inherits the crown, and with it, the right to build the institution around his own reign. William and Catherine may have agreed on the principle, but principles only become real when they collide with people, properties, and expectations built over decades. And that is where the story becomes far more complicated, because Clarence's house is not simply another royal residence. It carries the memory of the Queen Mother, the years of Charles and Camilla, and an entire model of royal continuity that William appears determined to leave behind. If the next reign is built around one sovereign, one court, and one working household, then Clarence's house becomes more than an address. It becomes a test. Who decides who lives there? Who controls its staff, its schedule, and its public role? And most importantly, does Camilla's position after Charles depend on tradition, or does it depend entirely on the new king? That distinction could define the transition between two generations of the monarchy. For Charles, the answer may feel personal because Clarence House has been connected to his public life for so long. For William, the issue is institutional. He is not simply deciding where one person lives. He is deciding whether the next reign inherits the structure of the previous one or starts with a deliberately smaller circle around the crown. And Catherine's signature makes the decision revealing. She would be accepting the same rule for herself. If the future king is George, then Catherine would also have to accept that her own status could change with the next reign. There would be no automatic second court simply because history had once allowed it. That is why the final question remains unanswered. What happens to Clarence House when Charles is no longer king? If William truly intends to create one sovereign, one court, and one working household, then the answer could determine how far that principle goes. It could affect Camilla, Catherine, George, the royal residences, and the public image of the monarchy itself. And if Clarence House becomes the place where the old model gives way to the new one, then this may not be remembered as a decision about one residence at all. It may be remembered as the moment William decided that the next monarchy would not simply inherit the past. It would redraw the boundaries of royal life. And that is where the story becomes even more consequential, because the person who ultimately controls Clarence House may reveal just how serious William's new rule is.